My name is Anne Marie Shea. I'm the president of Worcester Women's History Project, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 13th annual Women in Print event. Today we have 3 local authors. Not only will they be talking about a specific publication, but some of them have many books to their credit. So I will turn it over now to Susan Mcdaniel Chicagi, author of Living at the City's Green Edge.
Thank you. It's good to be here, an honor to be included in the group. I'm going to give you a brief overview of my book, Living at the City's Green Edge. So the book tells the story of a Worcester neighborhood. Those of you who live in Worcester probably know it. It was originally known as Bancroft Heights. However, we mostly know it as the Massachusetts Avenue neighborhood, or the Massachusetts Avenue Historic District. Bancroft Heights was laid out in 1898 by Worcester landowner Stephen Salisbury III. This subdivision plan shows not only the residential lots planned for this development, but also the green setting that was intended as well. An island of green down the middle of Massachusetts Avenue, so you can see here. A walking and riding trails here, and also up above where there's a monument, Bancroft Tower in Salisbury Park. So this was all part of Salisbury's original plan, both a housing development and a green setting, including a park with a monument. This is the way Main Street looked in 1898, around the turn of the 20th century. And the period from the 1880s through about 1930 can be called Worcester's golden age of industrial success. The inset shows Mayor Rufus B. Dodge, who was the mayor at the time that City Hall was built, and you can see City Hall here with the tall tower, a symbol of pride of the growing city, the wealthy city at that time. And as it turns out, Mayor Dodge was the first one to build a house in the new Massachusetts Avenue Historic District. It's easy to see, looking at this graph, that there was a need for a new city hall and for more housing as well, because you can see how the population was growing. If you look at 1900 and just the years before and the years after, you can see there was a continuous climb in the population spurred by the wealth of industry in the city. In fact, between 1890 and 1900, the population grew by more than 30,000 in only 10 years. And within only 4 years, by 20,000. So life was changing, and the landscape was changing as well. So all on the edges of the city, farms were being turned into subdivisions. And Stephen Salisbury III, whom you see here riding horseback, was one of the landowners who decided to build a subdivision on land that he owned. Salisbury laid out in about 1898 this plan, and building began in 1899. Bancroft Tower, which is right here on the plan, was completed and dedicated in 1900. The sale of lots and construction of houses took place between 1899 and 1926. And over time, houses in a variety of different styles were built, and they were mostly grand houses. Most of them were architect designed, and many of them were occupied by the city's leading citizens. Well, as I began working on the book, it became clear that I needed to set these houses in context and set the subdivision in context, and I began to get information from different property owners in the neighborhood and from people who had lived in Bancroft Heights in earlier times. And that was one of the most fun parts of the book, as I gave character to the neighborhood by learning about the families and the people who lived there and what they did. Another entertaining part of the research for me was to find out about the change in technology, which you can see here. If you look, this is a kitchen at 6 Massachusetts Avenue. The photograph was taken in 1957, but the cast iron range that had been put in when the house was built was still in place, although there was a gas range next to it. Well, that kitchen looks a lot different from most of our kitchens today, and they were also kitchens designed for servants, as were the houses in general. So it was fun to look for the lighting fixtures, for the bathrooms, for the kitchens, and none of the kitchens really survived in that shape. So that photograph was a wonderful find. It also seemed necessary to understand how and why the subdivision came about and how it grew. Salisbury's subdivision was laid out on the Johnson farm, and you can see the farmhouse at the top, the original Johnson farmhouse. And you can see the house that was built more or less in its place today. It stands right on the corner of Massachusetts Avenue and Salisbury Street. And you can see in this photograph the cart path that was part of the farm transportation routes. And the interesting thing is that you can still see today this tree on the green island in the middle of Massachusetts Avenue. So this is the west side of Massachusetts Avenue, and on the other side, which you can't see here, would be today's east side of Massachusetts Avenue. Again, a wonderful photograph to have found. So you might wonder why the name of the neighborhood, although we don't call it that very often, was Bancroft Heights. Well, it was called Bancroft Heights because right across the street from the new subdivision was the house where George Bancroft was born. This is his birthplace, and this is George Bancroft. And actually the land on which the Johnson farm was part of the farm that had belonged to George Bancroft's father, Aaron Bancroft, who was the first minister of the Unitarian Church. George Bancroft, we don't know much about today, but he was probably the best known man in the United States in his day. He was born in 1800. He was the author of the first serious and carefully researched history of the United States in 7 volumes, written over something like 20 or 30 years. He was the Secretary of the Navy under James K. Polk. He was the founder of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He was U.S. Minister to Great Britain and Prussia, which later became Germany. So he was a man of importance. He was born in Worcester, and he and his family were an important part of the community during his growing up years. Here you can see this monument. You may have seen it but never known what it was, alongside Salisbury Street, almost opposite the entrance to Massachusetts Avenue. This is a marker that celebrates the location of the birthplace of George Bancroft. So that gives you a physical idea of where the house was. The house was torn down in 1898, just before this development was built because of road widening, and it was said that the house couldn't be repaired. And so that's the usual story told to us preservationists. There's nothing to do but to tear it down. The plan for this residential subdivision included important elements of landscaping that I've mentioned, and it was also situated near Institute Park, which also had been donated to the city by Stephen Salisbury III. So as he was planning this neighborhood, he built another green area right adjoining a park that he had already established. Not only did Bancroft Tower and the monument to George Bancroft's birthplace on Salisbury Street give something of a historic aura to the new subdivision, a decision by a member of an important old Worcester family offered a sense of continuity with the past at a time when head-over-heels growth was creating breathtaking change in Worcester and obliterating so much of the physical evidence of earlier times. Miss Susan Trumbull decided to dismantle and reconstruct her 18th century family home on Massachusetts Avenue. That's number 6 Massachusetts Avenue if you're looking for it. But that house had begun life not as a residence, but as the second Worcester County Courthouse. It originally stood at Lincoln Square. Built in 1751, when Massachusetts was still a British colony. It had been the scene of numerous historical events. Here, John Adams, who later became president, apprenticed as a lawyer in his courtroom. It was from this court house that Crown-appointed officials were ousted in 1774, freeing Worcester County from British rule months before the outbreak of the Revolution. Here in 1783, the Quock Walker case was decided, the first case in the country where slavery was held unconstitutional. Several episodes of Shays' Rebellion also took place here, ultimately resulting in the establishment of our 3 governmental branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. When a new courthouse was to be built on Court Hill in 1801, the older courthouse building was moved from Lincoln Square down Main Street to the head of Green Street, where it served for nearly 100 years as the home of 3 generations of the Trumbull family. When Miss Susan Trumbull learned that the old homestead was to be demolished, she bought it, had it dismantled, and reconstructed as her home on Massachusetts Avenue. It's likely that the presence of this historic building encouraged the choice of the compatible colonial revival style for a majority of the houses on Massachusetts Avenue. And this is the way the house looked when it was at the head of Green Street. Why was Stephen Salisbury interested in developing his land? It was because he saw it as an economic opportunity. No, I don't think so. I think he really had Worcester's best interest in mind. And upon the death of his father, Stephen Salisbury II, in 1884, he began subdividing the family farm, which extended. Actually, his grandfather had built this house, the Salisbury Mansion. This photograph shows it in its original location, which is where the Boys Club building stands now in Worcester. When the Boys Club building was about to be built, this house was moved up the street to its current location on Highland Street. Stephen Salisbury I, Stephen Salisbury III's grandfather, owned land that is said to have extended all the way to Holden. So the two, Salisbury II and Stephen Salisbury III, inherited all this property. He had plenty of land to work with, as he had no children, was not married, and he knew he was the last in the line of the family, had to do something with the property. So his personal means of dealing with the great development pressures that were part of taking place in Worcester at that time was to develop the land in a way that he thought would best benefit the city, especially focusing on parks and creating a street, which we know now as Salisbury Street, which was lined with churches and cultural institutions. He gave land to some and sold land to others, but created what is now an important area of our city. And you may have noticed that recently a section there was created as the Salisbury Cultural District, recognizing the work that he did to create parks. Stephen Salisbury II gave land for WPI, the campus of WPI across the street from a park that he gave, and then along Salisbury Street, a variety of churches and other cultural institutions. In Salisbury Heights, Salisbury's planning attracted families who built handsome homes, some large, some smaller. These are on Regent Street, which was developed slightly later, not very much later than Massachusetts Avenue, but the houses, according to the taste of the time, were slightly smaller. The center island on Massachusetts Avenue adds a beautiful setting for houses built on relatively small lots. You'll notice that the houses are big, but their yards are not very large. This green surrounding really creates a park-like environment for these houses. And I was just speaking with someone who said that she liked to walk in that neighborhood because it was so pleasant, park-like along the street as well as in the park itself. Living at the city's green edge looks at the architecture and the variety of popular early 20th century styles seen in the neighborhood. and examines each neighborhood house by house, or examines the neighborhood house by house, including a current photograph of each and a brief description of its architecture. In a few cases, there are photographs taken inside the house, historic photographs. And there's some current photographs as well, because for each house that's in the local historic district, I have covered every family that lived there as well as I could from the time the house was built till 2010. So if someone's moved in or out since then, they might not have been covered. In rare cases, there are pictures of gardens. This is the garden of 1 Drury Lane, a historic photograph. And there are lots of family pictures, as I mentioned before, and often interesting stories to go along with the pictures. This is one of my favorite ones here. This is Mrs. Swift, who was the wife of an envelope manufacturer. She's in her World War I ambulance driver's outfit, and her husband told her she wanted to learn to drive. He told her that it wasn't proper for women to drive. She got the chauffeur to teach her to drive, and during World War I, she drove an ambulance for the Red Cross. So there's her picture, and actually here she is serving tea. So it's interesting to see the way of life that not that long ago was common in a Worcester neighborhood. So you see tea parties and horseback riding right on Massachusetts Avenue, and people dressed for dinner at someone's house. That's what's called dressing for dinner. So that's the book. It's for me. I'm education director for Preservation Worcester. I keep a copy of it right on my desk as a reference because I forget things about different people who were important people in Worcester's more recent history. And so it's both a history book, but I think you'll find that it's a book that's interesting to read because you'll find out about people and the lives they led, up to the present time to a certain degree in Massachusetts Avenue section of Worcester. Thank you. I'll just unplug it and we'll...
While we're taking care of some technical matters here, I want to thank Susan for a very interesting presentation. I feel like we have a little version of Downton Abbey right here in Worcester with those elegant dress for dinner photographs in addition to the wonderful architectural information. Our next speaker is Janine Atkins, who has, unlike Susan, has a fictional piece, and we move a little bit to the east of Worcester to those wonderful women in Concord who really did exist, but Janine has given a little imaginative twist.
Okay.
For liberal arts people, I think we're doing pretty good on the IT and the things today.
Thank you. Let me know if you can't hear me too well. I do have a... I'm trying to hold all these books too, and then I'll start waving my hands around and we'll be in a big mess. So anyway, thank you so much for asking me to come. It's really an honor. Women's history is my passion, and I so appreciate all the work that you do. It's true, I mostly fictionalize, and so I totally rely on wonderful researchers who find women from the past. I grew up in Sterling in the day when Louisa May Alcott was pretty much, my go-to girl. She was, she gave me hope. She was who I wanted to be. You could live a life independently and with your imagination. And I still adore her, but because of researchers like some of you, I found there were a whole lot of other women. And I came to Worcester Women's History Project seminar or something years ago, and they had this enormous binder full of women who had changed Worcester, and it was just astonishing and wonderful. So I really thank you. Mostly because remembering how I was, I like to show girls in particular that there are all kinds of things you can do. So before I talk about May Alcott in my newest book, I just show this is a book for teens called Borrowed Names, and it's about Marie Curie, the scientist, Madame C.J. Walker, businesswoman, and the writer Laura Ingalls Wilder, and their daughters. They all had astonishing daughters, too. They were all born in 1868. So I was able to show the different work they did, the different places they lived, but to show things that they had in common. Anne Hutchinson's Way. Probably many of you know there are 2 statues of women in Boston, and now there's a third one, I think, of 3 women. So I remember Anne Hutchinson as a sort of footnote in my history book. So I wanted to, show more of her heroic behavior. I mean, a renegade while raising 17 children. It's amazing. And girls who looked under rocks, about girls who explore nature. And the subject of my forthcoming book, Finding Wonders, 3 Girls Who Changed Science. So those were people I didn't, mostly had never heard about when I was growing up. And, they are coming more to light, so it's wonderful. Also wonderful to be out of the archives here among lovely people, but I'm already plotting my way back. I do love being in the quiet place, finding old papers, touching old papers. For me, I loved Louisa May Alcott, but I was so inspired by somebody whose story I felt was not as well known as it should be, which was her sister, May Alcott, who was an artist. May Alcott came from a literary family in a literary town, so that gave me plenty of saved letters and journals and memoirs to read. But history for me is most interesting when I look past some of the stories we've been told. Sometimes in those journals, people don't talk about the everyday tasks that they do, the things we take for granted, the neighborhood gossip, what the sisters said, in their bedrooms to each other. So I tend to like to begin with facts and then bring in my imagination. So what's missing can frustrate those who do research and write nonfiction, but for me, it's an opening, an invitation. So it's a perfect fit, I think, for women's history, where we sometimes know just a little bit of information, but somebody wasn't watching quite so much and recording things. It's wonderful to look at and touch some belongings, stare at paintings, walk where May Alcott walked, and swam where she swam. You can go to Walden Pond and see where you swim. There's still blueberry bushes, not so many water lilies. And those are the kind of things that I draw on as a fiction writer when we want the smells of gingerbread, the feel of curtains, the sensation of water on a long flannel bathing suit. I didn't dress up like May, but you could imagine that sensation. So that helps to bring the readers there and hopefully with the right images deepen some of the themes. Finding evidence of women beyond the margins often means looking within the stories of fathers and brothers. But in this case, we have the journals, letters, artwork that might have been left in attics or destroyed if not for a famous sister. It was convenient that their home base was a literary one with the Hawthorne family, sometimes living next door, the Emersons down the road, and Thoreau. So I read Walden not so much for the philosophy, though it's excellent if you understand. It's very excellent. But what birds might be flying, during the day when May was there, what plants would be in bloom. And he was meticulous about recording that kind of thing. So it was wonderful. You can still walk to Walden Pond from Orchard House. The Louisa May Alcott's house is open to the public, and there's a path called an amble, which is really about 2 miles, through the woods to get there. But you can, and of course there are different things there, but it's marked where Thoreau had his bean field and whatnot, and you can still see woods and some animals. I found allusions to May in biographies of Louisa, but not much. What isn't said says a lot. For instance, we read about Louisa's work as a nurse during the Civil War. Documents record her homecoming and typhoid fever that nearly took her life, and she wrote one of her first most successful books about that, Hospital Sketches. But I was wondering who took care of her. Certainly her mother did to some extent, but May was clearly the one who was washing up after her, giving medicine, cheering her up, emptying bedpans, staying through, putting aside her work to care. And that was a role, many single women in the 19th century took on. May took it on, but she really wanted to be an artist too, so that was a tug for them. And it also made me think of, that those who've read Little Women too see Amy, the name is twisted around the, letters of May to Amy, is always kind of called selfish, a little, she's spoiled. And she was the youngest, but it really seemed to me that she was overlooking the work she did. She was, as well as an artist and taking care of the family, she taught kindergarten, she taught in a care for an asylum for young girls. She did all kinds of things that Louisa never wrote about in order to kind of secure her idea that she just cared about clothes and hair and stuff like that, which she did care a lot about, but there were other things too. So I had to partly imagine myself in and also read about other artists of that period, women artists of that period, to get some of the details. I read, I daydreamed, I connected, and I don't know if I would have spent many years on this novel if it wasn't for my grandmother and for my sister. These are paints that I found in my grandmother's attic when she died. She was also a Red Cross person in World War I in France. She was also a painter, and she had told me I could have any of her art supplies when she died back when I was in the 20s. And I know my Uncle Henri said, "Good, you're cleaning out her room." And for me, this was where my interest in archives began, and becoming a historian, taking some of her sketches, taking some of her paints, and being able to understand more than I had known about her, which was just as, my grandmother pretty much. And the other person who was important to me was my older sister, because when we were growing up playing Little Women, she was Jo. So I didn't want to be Beth particularly, and I wasn't either Anna. So I became Amy, and I didn't think having the prettiest clothes was so bad either. I saw, there was something to be said for her. But I also, I think, understood that when Louisa wrote Little Women, it was her point of view, and there was another story from another sister's point of view, and that kind of stayed with me. So I just want to show you a little bit of her work. This one of her students painted this of her when she was living in Paris in her 30s, Rose Peckham. This is a not very good picture of Orchard House. Very graciously let me take some pictures. This was a watercolor she did of Orchard House, the place where Louisa wrote Little Women, and the family lived for many years. She did a book called Concord Sketches, and this was the Emerson House. Often Girls by Gates, Girls in Boat she did. This was after Thoreau's death, so you can see the cabin up there. She imagined that, although she drew it at Walden Pond, and the Hawthorne's house next door. And this was a painting of the owl that when Louisa was very sick, she painted this above her fireplace in her room. And also when Louisa was sick from the hospital, her father made this table for her, and May painted the flowers on it, and that's where she wrote Little Women. May was the first illustrator of Little Women, this skating scene, Vanity Fair scene. And this, her father did respect her enough to give her a small studio in the house. He took a shed and attached a studio, and these were drawings of people who came in to visit her. She did drawings there that you can see these if you visit Orchard House. Her dream was to go to France, to study in France. These were the years before the MFA was open in Boston. That wasn't until 1878. And so people would go to the Louvre, and they would paint by studying life, and by studying paintings, copying. So she did this. And she had 2 paintings in the salon, very, very prestigious, a thrill for her, again, of an owl, a motif, and a still life. And La Negresse was also a model she got to paint. She was also, for her own painting, we also honor her as a teacher. She taught many people, including Daniel Chester French, who sculpted the Minuteman in Concord, and of course Lincoln Memorial. And he was a great sculptor, and if you visit his house in the Berkshires, you can see under the ruler with his name is the tool that May gave him, and he honors her as his first sculpting teacher. She also became friends with Mary Cassatt. One of her paintings got in the salon a year. Mary's was rejected, called Yellow Women, too bright, too impressionistic, not the style. So they, became great friends, helping each other. And also, I think if May had not died so early, she would have been very interested in the Impressionism. And this is the last painting she did of a geranium. And so, based on the research, I wrote Little Women in Blue, and about May Alcott's life. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. I also got through my childhood saying maybe I could grow up to be one of those wonderful independent and literary and artistic women. Our final presenter this evening, Lynn Lincourt, will be talking to us about mansions and madmaids. Lynn?
I hope I'm not dull. I don't have any pictures to show you, and I do apologize for that. I do want to thank all the people here at for this. I'm so honored to be chosen as a woman to print. Last year, I heard about WWHP, who believes that, and that I do that. We can learn from history, or as they say, we remember the past to better shape the future. And that is very inspirational, because that's exactly how I feel. So I felt immediately that we were friends. I moved here from Alexandria, Virginia in 2008, joining the Historic Society and researching the tannery just around the corner. And it was built in 1798, so I decided, just as a little aside, that I was going to just study it and, write a little thing about it, because I'm a writer. A writer has to write. So I wrote all the time about it, and what happened was that I heard that there was an opening in the Shrewsbury Commission, Historic Commission, a volunteer position. And so I went ahead and sent them a copy of what I'd written on the tannery. And lo and behold, they hired me as a volunteer to be a member of the committee. So in the very first night, they came up with this idea that we've always wanted to write about the mansions. Of course, my ears perked up, and I thought, I could do that. I thought it was part of a project, the whole for the organization. It was my project. And that was in 2009. By 2010, I was beginning to develop other things. It was kind of interesting. And I began with the history of the various mansions and some pictures about them. I learned about how to describe the types and so forth. But what absolutely enchanted me was the idea of the people who came here. And that's where I got the idea of every one of us is here because our ancestors took a chance. And they made their own lives and did phenomenally well. And I thought, that's the theme of my book. So it started out being mansions of Shrewsbury, but then it also became a lot of other things, the story of people. And I've been in a peculiar situation because I have lived in New York City, and I was going to, where I was working there for about 15 years. I wanted to be an actress. Well, I thought I had done a lot because I was always acting in Rhode Island. But what did they think of me? They didn't think much. So I began thinking about that, and I thought, well, I think I'll better get a job. I was working for myself. I was supporting myself. I was sending money home to Dad, who was in his late 80s and 90s at that point. I was the baby sister. And I suddenly realized that I was a character actress, but I was a young one, and I didn't have the background they needed, and I did some acting. I actually am a member of a couple of the unions, and it was just frustrating because I didn't match. I didn't fit. I was the little one with the sort of corny teeth. They were uneven. And I was a brunette, and my skin broke out if I used makeup, so I was plain, the plain little creature. And then I discovered it was a kind of advantage, because I went in one place to apply for an audition, and there were 5 women sitting there, and so help me, I thought at first that they were quintuplets, because they all had big, beautiful smiles, and they all had blonde hair, and they all dressed the same way, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. So then, well, who was the one that was chosen for the interview? Me. They saw me. They just didn't see the others because they were like twins. And so that was a part of my advantage sometimes, but it didn't always work. So I ended up by doing a lot of off-Broadway. And since that was very, cheap productions, I ended up also helping backstage. So I became part of the multiple personality, depending on what they wanted. I also was part of a children's group where we had every Saturday we had shows for children, and the man I was associated with was a very good, a very creative man, but much to my dismay, I didn't realize until later that he was not a very honest man. So suddenly I discovered that we weren't paying bills, and I was contributing. So we weren't paying bills, and he sort of disappeared, and I wasn't responsible. We were just associates in theater, but it was the end of my directing and whatnot. Then I got a full-time job. And that's when I finally went to college. I went nights, I went Saturdays, and every summer I did 2 courses. So I started in January 56. Then I was allowed to graduate with a class of allowed to graduate with the class in June, but I didn't get my diploma because I had to do 2 more courses that summer. So I got my diploma by going up to the office and getting them in September. So that's the story of New York City. But then I decided I had to really become an honest woman and get a full-time job that I really liked. And I kept trying to get jobs. And by that time, I was beyond I was beyond 30. And as anybody knows, in the business world at that time, you succeeded as far as your 29th birthday, and then by the time you were 30, you were passé, kid. So, yes. So anyhow, I had my degree, and I finally applied for a federal job, which I had never intended doing because my 2 sisters had left when I was 7 to work in the government, and I wasn't going to follow my sisters' plans. So there. So what happens? I end up in Washington, D.C. I started in New York City, and that was fascinating because I was a wage and hour investigator in the garment district. And believe it or not, in 1960, there were the type of work in places that were the major fires of the 1905. And I was in one of them. Hottest day in summer. They were on in a crowded room. The back door was locked, so they had only one exit. It was appalling. So how much do we advance? There was always somebody who sort of left out. But now we go back. We finally end up. I'm in New York City, but then I go to Washington, D.C., because they thought they needed some women to look good in the middle grades. So, and it was very interesting because the men started as GS5s, but we had all said what grade we would consider. We had all put 7. There were 3 of us high, 3 women, and all of us had put grade 7. So they started a 5, but we started as a 7. Then at the end of 6 months, they would get they got the 7, we got the 9. And then at the end of the year, they got the 11, and they got the next grade step anyway. And we ended up, the women were 6 months ahead all along the way. We ended up with an 11. And I was in government and finally ended up as a child labor specialist, and of course wrote. I was a writer, so I was writing for the various and sundry legal situations, but never with my name. So I've been printed, but nobody knows me. So then, what happened? Oh yes, I decided I better come home to the New England area, and because that's where I had relatives. So I came here in 2008. 2009, I started a column where we live. It was Lynn's Spin, and I still do it. And one day, somebody said to me, "That was good, you're a writer." And I'm thinking, oh, I'm a writer. Oh, I didn't know that. So that's when I really started thinking about writing about the mansions. The mansions were my chance, and I met fantastic people, including the gentleman who came to to give us a little bit of a help. I don't know whether Chris is here or not. There's Chris. He's my co-researcher, and he was co-chair of the commission. And I must say, I may be a little prejudiced, but I don't think so. He is a fantastic researcher. But we were both pretty good. I learned a lot from him. And so we finished, it was over 6 years, at least. And we went all over the places. We met all these wonderful people. We even discovered an early mansion that nobody knew existed, pretty much. And it had actually been purchased by a lady whose husband was an industrialist in Boston. And most of these were about industrialists in Boston or Worcester. And he was different. So this place was actually bought during the time of, we were still a part of England. And it was under the king of England, when a group of people bought the land of an Indian. And then they split it up among themselves. And eventually, in the late 1800s, this lady bought the only one who had outlived everybody and had all of the land that she needed was a woman, which was very rare at that time. And it purchased by a woman, from a woman, and that became this wonderful place that was ended up being a mansion. The original house, which was built from the one in the 1700s, is a beautiful mansion. And there was a third house. And the interesting way, to get to the mansion, you had to go past the third house because of the hill. It's a big land, and it's hilly. So the result was that you had people who had two mailboxes in the same place, and they both had the same number, and so the postman would leave one for the mansion and one for the other house. That drove me batty, because I didn't know why they had the same number for two in some portion. So that's part of researching. And I think I've spent more than my time than I'm allowed, and I want to thank you very much. But I do want to add this last point, because this is a very special organization. And so I looked up some information about Abby. Abby Kelly Foster, the ardent Quaker who sought to end race and gender prejudice, led the 19th century abolitionist and women's movements. And she led the fight, which started pretty much here in 1850 at Brindley Hall in Worcester on October 23rd. She spoke of the 14 years of persecution for seeking the same opportunities for women that men had. And she was just one of many brave, determined people who fought for and won the right to vote for all citizens, regardless of gender or race. The USA was based on a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We legal citizens are the people and can take the chance, diligently study the issues and the merits of the contenders, and vote accordingly. Democracy provides the opportunity that made us strong, so let's restore the land, the seas, and a united country of proactive citizens like Abby. Thank you. Oh, by the way, this is the book.